Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike that the torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans born in this century, tempered by war, disciplined by a hard and bitter peace, proud of our ancient heritage, and unwilling to witness or permit the slow undoing of those human rights to which this nation has always been committed and to which we are committed today.
He was always very good with bold rhetoric. Many people have identified, however, when you listen to the inaugural speech or read it, where's civil rights? Where is any kind of comment about that element? And that was just not on his radar. When Kennedy thought of race, as most people did, I suspect, at that time, the race they had most in mind is the one with communism and the competition in the world between the free world and the communist world. And that's what Kennedy spoke most about on that morning.
Not until the final months of his life did civil rights become the moral imperative that he would be willing to stake his political future on. Kennedy's record as a congressman and senator was mixed. He supported Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954 and mentioned civil rights in several speeches. But for the 1957 Civil Rights Act, Kennedy voted in favor of Title IV, termed the Jury Trial Amendment, which civil rights activists felt greatly weakened the act. During his 1960 presidential campaign, going against the advice of his closest aides, including his brother Bobby, when Martin Luther King was arrested in the aftermath of a sit-in at an Atlanta restaurant, Kennedy telephoned Coretta Scott King and offered to help. Within a few hours, King was released from jail. Only a few months later, though, shortly before delivering his inauguration speech, Kennedy chose to edit out a strong passage concerning civil rights in favor of something less contentious that didn't mention race.
My own perspective is that of having worked for Robert Kennedy when he was a senator, but I was very aware of what was happening in the country, the determination and courage of people, young people who sat at lunch counters protesting segregation, of the lawyers who had brought Brown v. Board of Education and succeeded, of the freedom riders who went down to the South and risked their lives, all of that. And because of the civil rights movement, JFK responded. Didn't do it so much at first. It took a couple of years before he, and urged very much by Robert Kennedy, decided to go ahead and seek legislation. And of course, what happened with the civil rights movement pushing and pushing, and the police dogs of Bull Connor in Birmingham, and children going to jail to make the point about an end to the horrific segregation, apartheid that we had in the United States.
So it's a very complicated topic. It gets involved with communism as well. I mean, the Communist Party, always wanting to make propaganda moves, would have an easy day of identifying the land of freedom, and then you look in the heart of the land of freedom and you see the sizable contingent of American citizens denied the right to vote, denied the right to travel, go down the list. It would be very hard for John Kennedy or any president to brag about freedom or to market freedom and talk about the tyranny of the communist world when you got that happening right in your backyard, and newspapers are printing pictures and stories are coming out. I mean, it was exceedingly embarrassing, and it hurt them in the foreign policy game. But the fact that communists would infiltrate civil rights movements and work from within those was also a fact that complicated Kennedy's dealings with civil rights. If you found, for example, that some of the activists in the black community had communist connections, either in the past or at the present, at the time. And that became known, what would happen? This would be a terrible catastrophe. Oh, Kennedy's soft on communism? This would be an embarrassment. And he would find it very difficult domestically to get support for measures on, you name it, housing, voting, whatever. He would lose so much support among Democrats as well as Republicans. He couldn't be identified with that. He couldn't be partnered with, communists. And that was an issue that was really troubling. And it troubled them to the point where they even, worked with J. Edgar Hoover carefully to wiretap, and to conduct surveillance on members of the civil rights community. Martin Luther King's attorney, people within Martin Luther King's immediate inner circle, Martin Luther King himself wiretapped. And this was all done with the knowledge of John Kennedy, his permission. His younger brother, as Attorney General, working with J. Edgar Hoover, did this regularly, routinely. And they found out information they didn't really want to know.
During his first year as president, Kennedy believed that there was not enough support in Congress for a civil rights bill. Not wanting to jeopardize what legislation he did propose, his major concern was not alienating the Southern Democrats, who held key seats on several important foreign policy committees. He also resisted meeting Martin Luther King Jr., in part because of his concern about Southern Democrats, but also, no less significantly, because of the administration's unease with what he perceived as a sizable communist element within King's movement. King finally said that he would never again request an appointment with the president personally, despite a campaign promise to issue an executive order banning housing discrimination as soon as he took office. Kennedy waited until after the 1962 midterm elections to do so, in the end restricting the law to cover only public housing and homes financed by government-guaranteed loans. In May 1961, when a group of freedom fighters in Alabama was attacked and beaten by local white men, the president's first reaction was annoyance. He was more concerned about what he called this goddamn civil rights mess, and how it might hurt his ability to work with Southerners in Congress and damage the United States' image abroad, in particular with the Soviets, who could use it to demonstrate the hypocrisy of the U.S. fighting for freedom abroad while failing to ensure it at home. In commentating about the incident, Bobby wondered if the freedom riders had the best interest of the country at heart. It took 5 days for the president to make his first remark, a rebuke of both sides, saying that he hoped the participants would refrain from any action that might provoke further outbreaks. Less than a week later, while giving his second State of the Union address, no mention was made of the events in Alabama or civil rights. The Ole Miss Riot of 1962 was fought between Southern segregationalist civilians and the federal and state authorities over the admission of James Meredith, a black student, into the University of Mississippi. The blockade was supported by Mississippi Governor Ross Barnett and sparked riots on the Oxford campus. President Kennedy had hoped to use legal measures to quiet the situation, but was eventually forced to send in military police and the National Guard.
Americans are free and sure to disagree with the law, but not to disobey it. For in a government of laws and not of men, no man, however prominent or powerful, and no mob, however unruly or boisterous, is entitled to defy a court of law. If this country should ever reach the point where any man or group of men, by force or threat of force, could long deny the commands of our court and our Constitution, then no law would stand free from doubt. No judge would be sure of his writ, and no citizen would be safe from his neighbors.
Nearly 6,000 troops patrol Oxford to maintain order, and arrests mount to more than 200 as smaller disturbances erupt the next day. Former Major General Edwin Walker, who came here from his home in Texas, is put under arrest and held in high bail on charges of inciting insurrection. He was flown to a federal prison hospital as relative calm settled on the town in the greatest crisis the South has faced since the Civil War.
Though Kennedy had designated civil rights advisors, he usually ignored them. He avoided the 100th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation, acknowledging it only by recorded message, instead going sailing.
I take great pleasure in greeting you on this centennial commemoration of one of the most solemn moments in American history. 100 years ago today, Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. He thereby began the process which brought a final end to the evil of human slavery, which wiped out from our nation what John Quincy Adams called the great stain upon the North American Union. But the Emancipation Proclamation was not an end. It was a beginning.
At a White House reception marking Lincoln's birthday, because of the number of African Americans attending, likely the largest group ever admitted to the White House, guests were greeted at an entrance away from photographers. At the sight of Sammy Davis Jr. in attendance with his wife Mary Britt, who was Swedish and white, the president urged an aide to get them out of here. Jackie was so appalled by her husband's behavior, she left the reception in tears.
It was a source of great embarrassment to him, something he never liked. It was something that pressured him, which he didn't like to be. It's something that made a lot of noise, which John Kennedy never liked when it comes to dealing with things. All of the reasons, in other words, politically and personally, John Kennedy would operate against it. But it was an issue that wouldn't go away. And it wouldn't go away, and it got worse and escalated, in part because of the timidity or the caution with which John Kennedy tried to handle this.
It took Alabama Governor George Wallace blocking the doorway of the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa to stop two African-American students, Vivian Malone and James Hood, from attending school for John F. Kennedy to finally find the moral impulse within himself to push ahead civil rights legislation. On the evening of June 11, 1963, with no prepared speech and a half-finished script, Kennedy went on television. He spoke for 18 minutes, most of it spontaneous. During the speech, he proposed legislation that would require the end of segregation in almost all areas of American life.
Fires of frustration and discord are burning in every city, north and south. Where legal remedies are not at hand, redress is sought in the streets, in demonstrations, parades, and protests, which create tensions and threaten violence and threaten lives. We face, therefore, a moral crisis as a country and a people. We have a right to expect that the Negro community will be responsible, will uphold the law, but they have a right to expect that the law will be fair, that the Constitution will be colorblind, as Justice Harlan said at the turn of the century. This is what we're talking about, and this is a matter which concerns this country and what it stands for. And in meeting it, I ask the support of all of our citizens. Thank you very much.
I went to work in the Justice Department in the fall of 1963, when I had finished clerking for Arthur Goldberg, who was a justice on the Supreme Court. And I had a tremendous sense of joining an effort that was historic in our country. The Justice Department with Robert Kennedy as Attorney General, everything that by then had developed about civil rights and many of the other subjects that the Justice Department was involved in. So I had a tremendous sense of the country moving ahead and making historic changes, and that I would be a part of it.
There was just a fundamental misunderstanding here between John Kennedy and not just Martin Luther King, but all of the elements of the civil rights struggle. Kennedy never really understood, until the very end perhaps, the passion that was the force behind civil rights, the passion of it. And on the other hand, people like Martin Luther King and others never understood the politics of civil rights. And that fundamental misunderstanding complicated the ability of civil rights activists and members of the Kennedy administration of formulating a coherent policy about it. That's one of the other elements that I think really defines this.
The March on Washington on August 28, 1963, was one of the largest political rallies in the history of the United States. 2,000 buses, 21 special trains, and 10 airplanes had been chartered for the occasion, and it is estimated that as many as 300,000 people were in attendance. Over 500 cameramen, technicians, and correspondents from the major networks covered the event. Organized by a combined effort of religious, labor, and civil rights leaders, the group included Roy Wilkins, the head of the NAACP, the vice president of the AFL-CIO, A. Philip Randolph, who originated the idea of a march all the way back in 1941 during the Roosevelt administration, and the head of the Auto Workers Union, Walter Reuther. The theme of the march was jobs and freedom. The march was held on the 100th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation, and along with the efforts of John Kennedy, is widely credited with helping to push through important civil rights and voting rights legislation in the coming years. Beginning at the Washington Monument and ending at the Lincoln Memorial, the march was most famous for its iconic speeches and music, and Martin Luther King Jr.'s "I Have a Dream" speech, which was carried live by several television stations.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will they be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream.
At the end of the day, Kennedy would welcome the leaders of the march in his office at the White House.
So many things happened under John Kennedy when he was president that laid the groundwork for other things that came afterward. Certainly the civil rights legislation that John Kennedy proposed in 1963 that became the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Another area very tied to civil rights, because if you don't have the money to sit at a lunch counter and pay for the meal, the fact that you have the right to sit there isn't worth very much. And so under President Kennedy, the planning started for what became the War on Poverty, and specifically Robert Kennedy was at the heart of that. He hired his high school friend David Hackett to sit right in an office right next to him in the Justice Department that opened into Robert Kennedy's office. That's how important it was to the thinking of both President and Attorney General, both President Kennedy and Attorney General Kennedy. And so the meetings went on starting in 1961. Both people in the government and experts brought in from around the country, and thinking about what would an initiative be, especially to help young people getting into the labor market. How would that be configured? And that work that took place in Robert Kennedy's Justice Department office laid the groundwork for the War on Poverty, and Lyndon Johnson picked up on that. The country didn't understand about Lyndon Johnson because he was a Southerner and he was connected to big oil, that he also cared a great deal about civil rights and poverty, having grown up in poverty himself. And so President Kennedy laid the groundwork, opened the pathway, and the result was the Economic Opportunity Act of 1964, which we call the War on Poverty.
I think by the end of his short time as president, as he said in that very famous speech, it became kind of he understood the moral issue involved here. And that was a bold step for him. And I think it is interesting to wonder, had Kennedy lived, had Kennedy been reelected, and those are, not certainties about reelection, what would he have done? How would that have looked? It's hard to say. I mean, it's clear, that the civil rights bill that he sent to Congress was pretty stalled, wasn't going anywhere in any time soon. And the fact that his martyrdom, his death, did more to push that than his life did, it's so difficult to say. I mean, when Lyndon Johnson addressed the nation and the Congress, and he used those words that were so perfect and calculated to say, let us continue. That was brilliant. I mean, what Johnson did as a master politician was to adorn his policies in the cloak of John Kennedy, and that proved to be very persuasive. Who would vote against the wishes of a martyred president in the period of the grief? I mean, Johnson moved on that quickly. So Kennedy's death, tragic, brutal, horrific, had a profound beneficial effect, certainly on many things, but I think first and foremost on civil rights. And maybe in an ironic way, that's the way that whole civil rights movement was furthered, by the blood of martyrs.
And then when President Kennedy was assassinated, it turns out that it was fortunate that Lyndon Johnson had been chosen to be vice president and became president. His presidency was hugely injured by getting so deeply into Vietnam. But on civil rights, he proved himself to be deeply committed. And the result of his becoming president and the master of the Senate and the Congress that he was, that it produced the historic progress in civil rights, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, voting rights in 65, fair housing in 1968. And John Kennedy really did start that in motion by asking in early 1963 that Congress act and start the process of enacting historic legislation.
Ultimately, it took Kennedy's death and the political savvy of Lyndon Johnson to finally bring civil rights and voting rights legislation to fruition. With it, like the men Kennedy himself had celebrated in his book, Profiles in Courage, John F. Kennedy joined the ranks of those who had the courage to put moral imperative, and in this case, the greater good of the country, ahead of themselves.